Today, we're lucky to be joined by Katya Soldak of Forbes. Katya is a New York-based journalist and the editorial director of Forbes Media's international editions. Katya, who is Ukrainian American, is the director of the 2020 documentary, The Long Breakup, about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and the author of the memoir essay, This Is How Propaganda Works, about growing up in the Soviet Union. Her strongest focuses are Eastern Europe and anything related to post-Soviet territory, and she's been working with Forbes Ukraine to share coverage from the conflict. Katya, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're very happy to have you here. As we just mentioned, you've covered Eastern Europe and specifically Ukraine for a while. I know that your own parents just left that country across the western border from Kharkiv. Have you been in touch with them? Can you talk about how they're doing?
Yeah, it was such an ordeal. It was hard to imagine that it would ever happen, but when it was happening, we were also in disbelief that it was happening. And right now they crossed the border through Moldova to Romania, and now they're safe in Romania, and we're trying to figure out the next steps. I am in touch with them, but during the moments of evacuation, we were in touch all the time, day and night, navigating every step of what they were making. I could never imagine the way evacuation happens. And now when we've done it with them, and I help a few other people and everybody is helping each other, I understand that it's a stressful process where nobody knows what's going to happen next. You don't know which road to take, where airstrikes are going to happen, where to stay for the night, if the road is going to be, exploded and you can drive through it. You don't know which checkpoint is going to be open, how many people are going to be there, thousands or hundreds of thousands, and what's going to happen after you cross, who's going to meet you, are you going to have a place to stay? And this is what my parents have been through, and this is what millions, not millions, but at this point, thousands of people are going through. So that's the update on that.
Just to help us picture that, I mean, are you talking by cell phone? Are they in a car, like with a map, trying to drive through the countryside to get somewhere? And you're like, turn right, turn left. How does, what is happening?
Well, when my parents were leaving Kharkiv, the tanks were coming in that morning, moving into the main avenues. And my parents were very scared. It was early in the morning. There were a couple of other cars driving with them. It was loosely coordinated by somebody from the United States who already evacuated a few other people. So they had a Telegram channel where they communicated, and also they downloaded a couple of walkie-talkie apps where they were communicating, but at the end they were on their own. And when they were driving, sometimes they didn't have reception, so the map was not working. We didn't know where they were. When I say we, I mean me and my sister. We both live in the United States. They shared their location with us through iPhone, but again, it was not always coming through. Sometimes we didn't know where they were. Sometimes we had to call them and make sure that we understand where they are, where they're going to stay for the night. All of these details, we try to make sure we know where they are in case if something happens. They described that the roads, when they were leaving, it was only the third or the fourth day of the war. Right now, it's probably worse, but roads were empty. There were no signs because Ukrainian side took all the signs down. So if the enemy comes in, they wouldn't know names of towns or names of villages. So they were lost as well. They didn't know which way to go, left or right, what it meant. So it was very, very difficult for them, especially because they're not super adventurous people. They're just people who like to live planned, controlled life where they know what they're doing. And then they were just thrown into this adventure. So, they were very uncomfortable, out of place. I would say that they would almost break down at any moment, but somehow they supported each other. If the stepfather was sort of falling apart, then the mother was holding it together, and then they would switch. During this process, it's all about business. You don't really let emotions come through, because as soon as you start feeling something, you fall apart. These are the people who lived all their lives in Kharkiv. This is the city that's been heavily bombed, shelled, destroyed by now. And for them to leave everything that they worked for, all the apartments, whatever belongings that they had, and they left with a small backpack or two, for him and for her, but there are no suitcases. There is like nothing, just a change of clothes, and that's it. Something that you would need during the emergency situation. And the moment they would think about that, my mom would just start crying. So the only way to do it would be like not to feel, not to think, just to keep going, trying to navigate the road, trying to call the volunteers at the border who would need them, not to take it like too hard, just to kind of power through. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how we all did it. We still continue doing it, as well as thousands of other people are doing it. So yeah.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that they reached safety. And in the middle of all of this, trying to track your parents leaving the country, you've also been coordinating Forbes US coverage of Ukraine with reporters and editors from Forbes Ukraine. And can you talk to us a little bit about the difficulties of doing that and read to us from some of their work?
At Forbes, we have a big team of people, so everyone is working on different stories, but I mostly facilitated connection with Forbes Ukraine, where we had reporters on the ground, and people there, they evacuated to the western side of Ukraine, but most of the editorial people, according to what I know, stayed in Kyiv. And it's hard for them to cover the news because the sirens go on, the possibility of an airstrike is high. So they go back and forth between shelters and their desks and computers. Reporting on things like this in the time of crisis, it's really hard. But so far we got all the news in time. Everything is covered. We check the accuracy of the information. They know what they're doing because they are on the ground and they've been reporting from Ukraine on Ukraine all these months and years. So they know exactly which sources to trust, which sources not to trust. They know towns, they know cities, they know names. So it's extremely helpful to have them. And, just trying to do your best. And I'm trying to do my best as well.
I wonder if you could read to us a little bit from some of the recent coverage.
Yes, of course. Of course. I'm going to read you about Kharkiv. Kharkiv was under intense shelling from 2 to 3 p.m. on February 28. Dozens of people are dead and hundreds are wounded, wrote Anton Gerashchenko, advisor to the Minister of the Interior. Russian military are attacking residential buildings in heavily populated areas. As a result of the shelling in Kharkiv, 15 military personnel and 16 civilians were hospitalized with injuries, one civilian death reported so far. The number of wounded and dead may change as shelling continues in Kharkiv. There are a lot of fires. Everyone is hiding as best they can. Anastasia Nish, the founder of the Kharkiv startup Yulomia, told Forbes Ukraine. Replenishing food supplies in Kharkiv is currently a difficult task. People have to wait in long lines. There are up to 200 people in supermarkets, says Nish. And of course, things have changed since then. It became much worse. What I've seen so far from the pictures, from the videos that people from Kharkiv sent to me, it's destroyed. The center of the city, university, some of the landmark churches, even just simply residential areas, they are shelled, they're burned. It's really hard to imagine the impact of what happened. And there is no point in what happened as well, because you can't use this city in any capacity. You destroyed it, you turned people against, the Russian military, but the city looks destroyed. I was in Kharkiv in April 2021 for months. And I got a chance to enjoy living in the city and see what it looks like, not as a tourist, but as a person who lives there with my family. And it was a beautiful, lovely city, manicured, with very nice little benches, little cute shops and cafes. It's the second largest city in Ukraine with beautiful supermarkets and some old style, European style architecture. Now I look at the pictures that, are posted or sent to me. It's burned. It's black. It's, it's ruined. There's smoke everywhere. It's impossible to imagine how it happened, but it happened. The city is destroyed. Other cities in Ukraine maybe are not, at this point, are not destroyed as much, but Kharkiv is very close to the border. So I imagine that it's very easy for the Russian military to just shell it from without actually getting into the city or too close or too far into Ukraine. So it's a very easy target.
That piece was by, and you'll help me out, I hope, with this name, Darina? Darina
Antoniuk.
Darina, okay. How is that reporter doing?
She's not in Ukraine. She
Okay.
is in Riga. She got stuck in Riga. She went for some journalistic conference and she couldn't come back. Her mother is in Ukraine, in some town, isolated from a lot of other people, and she's worried about her mother, of course.
So I should mention that we are speaking to Katya on March 4th, Friday, and the news is advancing. It is at a terrific pace. And I should say we have some of Whitney's students are working on the show with us this semester, and they were helping me to prepare questions for you. And they were but their articles are coming at such frequency. They were, the pace of the coverage is so intense. And I was thinking about the difficulty also of describing the big picture. And just yesterday, there was a piece that mentioned, about 875,000 people have fled Ukraine over the past week. And you mentioned Romania. And of course, there are folks also going to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova. And there was also a recent decision by Ukraine and Russia to provide humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians and to deliver food and medicine to the areas with the most violence. And because so much of the statements coming out of Russia are not accurate, like their descriptions of what is happening seem so obviously to be false. So how should we understand, and especially like listening to these individual stories of displacement, I'm just wondering how much these humanitarian corridors, this decision will change things for people trying to leave Ukraine, or as in the case of your colleague, possibly trying to go back in. Will it actually make things easier for Ukrainians to evacuate, or will there still be other difficulties for them?
To be honest, I didn't get a chance to check up on the status of this green corridor, but last time I saw, it was not going to happen. I don't think they agreed on that. Did you check recently? Did you check today?
Let's check.
Yeah, let's check. I think that it was in the news, I feel like late last night. And it was in the March. Oh, so you think that they reversed the decision that's in your March 3rd roundup?
Well, so much is happening. So this is the aspect that I didn't get a chance to check myself.
Sure.
But last time I saw, there was no agreement on that. I think they said no green corridors.
Reuters is reporting that it happened from 21 hours ago. But 1 hour ago from the Washington Post, Russia is not cooperating on proposed humanitarian corridor in Kherson, Ukrainian officials say.
That's what I think I saw. We don't know for sure if this is going to happen. And even if they agree on something, I wouldn't trust too much into whatever agreement is going to take place. Things are still going to be very difficult, and you can't really trust that it's going to be possible to do things peacefully.
I mean, Putin, as you were saying, he's already shelling residential areas. So why would he want to allow humanitarian aid to come to any of these towns? He's doing inhumane things in them. I don't understand. It made no sense to me why he would make. It made sense to me as a human being why you would want to make such an agreement, but he is not a person who I would attribute normal motives to.
Right. I just saw in the news that AFP reported that in the call with German Chancellor, Putin said that they're not bombing Ukrainian cities, that it's absolutely false propaganda. And this is, no matter how many times we all get used to hear things like this and trying to get used to it, it's just astonishing to hear these kinds of things. There's this evidence, there are videos, there are eyewitnesses, and then the president of the country is telling to another leader of another country that they're not doing it. It's really something.
It's terrifying. I find we saw some of that with our president, Trump. Like I remember his very first press conference when Sean Spicer said, well, his crowd was quite large, and that sort of deliberate lying means things, right? It means dangerous things. And whenever you see leaders doing it, it's really frightening, because it implies that they have become untethered from reality, or that they believe they have the power to be untethered from reality. I'm also reminded of, I will have to check on who this was, but I think it was Cheney who said, the American politician who said, we create our own reality. And that was when we were invading Iraq, another extremely stupid and dangerous war that America happened to start. And that's what seems like Putin's doing. Like he thought he could create his own reality here, basically.
And then I think, of course, we can also, see other precedents. I remember Trump also lied about how people seeking asylum were being treated at the border, which were some of our earliest episodes. And my family is Sri Lankan. So watching an authoritarian leader lie about shelling their own citizens is something I have certainly seen before. And it's horrifying every time it happens. And Whitney mentioned before, talking about your parents being displaced, but then also, and then you were mentioning Kharkiv, which is that where you grew up?
Yep.
I am so sorry. I am wondering also about some people are leaving and others are not able to leave. And you were describing the city. And so some people are still there, of course. And the first Ukrainian city, Kherson, has fallen into Russian control. That happened just very recently. Who knows how things are moving even as we're speaking. I'm wondering what this means for the Ukrainian citizens of Kherson. And as if more cities are occupied by Russian forces, what will happen to the people left behind? Is there any sense of how this is unfolding for those unable to leave? Or who don't want to?
Well, in Kharkiv, a lot of people didn't leave, A, because they didn't believe that things can get so bad, B, because they had families that couldn't be moved, somebody's disabled or somebody's elderly, it's not possible. And some people just want to stay because they love their town, their city, and they want to defend their country. The level of patriotism skyrocketed. It was always high since the Maidan revolution and the first invasion when it just started in 2014. But this particular war turned people even somewhat friendly and still open to something or open to some Russian propaganda. They just became very patriotic and they are ready to defend their country. So they stayed there because they want to be there. They want to fight the enemy. And I cannot speak for Kherson because I don't know anyone there, but based on what I see in other occupied areas and in Kharkiv, if they're going to be occupied, people are going to fight. They're not going to be, following the rules or welcoming the occupiers. They're going to make their life hell. They're going to die. Ukrainian people will die, but they're not going to stop. This is the spirit that is in Ukraine right now, and this is what I see everywhere. So if you saw the video on the internet, maybe not, of a woman who ran into a guy on the road. There was a Russian military guy with a gun, and there are tanks behind him, and she doesn't have anything. And he tells her, show me your passport. And she just starts fighting him. She's like, who are you? Why did you come here? I'm not supposed to show you my passport. And you think she would be scared. She would be trying to show the passport and at least, get away safe and alive. But no, she confronts him, she fights. And that's the spirit of a lot of people in Ukraine right now. And those who are armed and stronger, they just gonna fight. And in Kherson, I can't imagine that they just going to be, taken over and everything is going to be just fine.
So as we're watching the news about some people who are trying to leave the Ukraine, there have been a number of reports specifically about foreign students or international students, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism released a statement condemning racism directed at Black Africans, Indian and Pakistani nationals, and people of Middle Eastern descent, and others who are attempting to leave and who are facing racism at the borders and in other contexts. And I was wondering what that discrimination looks like for Black and Brown communities in Ukraine, and if there are any ways that are any way to combat that racism that's preventing them from crossing borders.
Well, I'm not really sure about what's happening on the border. To be honest, I don't know much about that subject. I just know that not on the border in Ukraine, there is a lot of support for IT people who are from different nations, and there is a whole movement to help evacuate those startups or those companies if they work. Some of them work. There is a big friendly cooperation between Ukrainian and people from other countries to bring their people back. So I don't know about the border, but I know that inside Ukraine, that discrimination is not really, something that's taking place out in the open. From what I know, people are helping people, and that's what they do.
Your documentary, The Long Breakup, shares the historical challenges of Ukraine sort of trying to escape from Russia's embrace. Do you think Ukraine has a chance? You were saying like people will continue to fight, but every military expert that I hear on American media is saying like, yeah, okay, they're fighting, and Russia did a bunch of dumb things at the beginning of this, but Russia's going to win. Do you agree with that?
I don't want to confuse my wishful thinking with what the accuracy of prediction is, but I just saw the reports from Bellingcat. I don't know how credible it's considered here, but in Europe, people trust their research. They say that Russia already used up a lot of their military. They may not have a lot of resources. I do think that Russia didn't use some of the really scary weapons that they have, and I'm sure it could be an option, because judging by everything that's happening right now, including capturing the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia yesterday, I think that things can get worse. And in that case, I don't know who can fight those dangerous weapons. And I don't know who is going to win in that situation. But if we stay on more conventional path, I think Ukraine's military right now is strong enough, but you also should not dismiss the spirit of people. They're fighting for their land. And I don't want to sound like a patriotic lunatic, but motivation means a lot. Even athletes, when they fight or when they compete in competitions, they need to believe in themselves, and they win. If they think that they don't win, they don't do well. Same with this. They have military capabilities. They have a lot of advising from different countries. They just had some special combat coming from Israel, some veterans from Israel. We don't know truly the capacity of Ukrainian army, but I just know that in Russia, even though their soldiers are demoralized and it looks like things are not going the way they planned, they still have pretty dangerous weapons that they didn't use. And in that case, nobody knows.
When you say pretty dangerous weapons, are you talking like tactical nuclear devices? Are you talking cluster bombs, or what specifically are you thinking of?
I don't know, chemical weapons.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Weapons.
Forgot about that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, based on what you're saying, like this idea of fighting a war when you're fighting and you have an actual reason to fight. This is the thing that I feel like Putin just doesn't get. And I'm not going to say that I know more than that guy, but I do know the feeling of being, I was a reporter in Iraq during the war. And when you're there and you think you might die the next day, the soldiers who were there, and certainly me, thought, when you go to bed, if I died, how would this be explained to my children? What would people say? People say that I was doing a good thing or a bad thing. Is this a good reason for me to die? And no amount of disinformation can get that thought out of your head. And so the Russian soldiers, I believe, are thinking those same thoughts. And they don't have a good answer to that question. I do know that Ukrainians probably do. This is, my country's been invaded and I'm going to fight for it. That is at least an answer that you can live with. And I think that Putin did not take that into account.
I think you're exactly right. I think you got it.
It does seem like there are, a number of stories that indicate that, I mean, you were talking about the motivation of the Ukrainians, and the lack of motivation for the Russians seems also to be presenting itself in different ways. And then also what you were mentioning, how this was analogous perhaps to, in some ways, like almost athletic motivation. I was reading about a tennis pro who has returned to fight in Ukraine, and also about a trumpeter who is making his contribution by playing the anthem. And we've seen these really moving stories of ordinary Ukrainian civilians who should not have to do this, of course, resisting Russian invasion and occupation. And in a recent episode, we spent some time considering Ukraine's literary history and community. And so I was wondering if you knew anything about what the arts community's resistance looks like.
We have several prominent stars in Ukraine, poets and musicians that are trying to keep the spirit up for Ukrainians. I see their campaigns on Instagram where they record little videos, they sing songs, they come out, they perform, they basically communicate with their audience and trying to tell them that we're here for you, with you, and they try to uplift the spirit by either reading their poems and having gatherings, even in this dangerous time, or singing. There is a lot of support that's coming from the artistic world. I also know that outside of Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainian artists or Ukrainian American or Canadian artists, they're doing a lot to support Ukraine, organizing either fundraisers or flash mobs or something that would bring awareness or support the spirit or push for some cause like no-fly zone. Just yesterday, I met with a group of Ukrainian artists here in New York in Shevchenko Society, and they were planning something, some kind of action, some performance in New York to bring attention to the problem. So people in all areas of lives are very, very active. But I would say that these two prominent musician Vakarchuk from this very popular band, Okean Elzy, and the poet from Kharkiv, Serhiy Zhadan, they're doing a lot for Ukrainian community right now.
We talked about Zhadan's work in that earlier episode with the Yale historian Marcy Shore. And I'm just curious to know, like, specifically, do you have any, like, he's in Ukraine right now? He's okay. He's okay.
If you follow his Instagram account, you will see
We'll
he's
go
there.
check.
He's ready to fight. He's recording videos. He's getting together with other people. They're checking up on things. He's not going to leave. People like Zhadan or Vakarchuk, or if you look at every prominent leader in Ukraine, they're staying and they're working on behalf of their country. They're not hiding. They're not escaping. Maybe they evacuated their families. I can imagine that. But journalists, TV hosts, people who feel like they can contribute into this fight and win and support the country by being there. They are in Ukraine and they're not leaving.
I feel like there is, other people have mentioned this, I feel like the world is dividing again into authoritarian and non-authoritarian sort of spheres of influence. And we have had on this show, we talked a lot about authoritarianism in countries like Poland, even though Poland is now part of NATO and supposedly helping out with this. But I mean, the Law and Justice Party is a party that's more Putin-esque than a Democratic Party. And there's Hungary's government and there's Bolsonaro in Brazil. So there's this kind of like axis of authoritarian leaders who are imitating and working with each other. And Ukraine, the West and democratic regimes have not been stopping them physically. Ukraine is the first country to fight Putin, a first European country, let's put it that way, because certainly the rebels in Syria fought against Putin, and certainly people in Chechnya fought against Putin, but the first European country to fight against him, stand up and fight him. And the way that Zelensky, that video that he did where he said, I'm here and my cabinet is here, I think is incredibly motivating and showing the possibility that in fact, what democracies are going to have to stand up against this at a certain point.
I agree with you. I think that Ukraine takes up this special place where the country was very young and they got a taste of freedom and what it's like to live in a liberal society. And Ukrainian government has never had the capacity to create authoritarian regime. Like in Russia, for instance. In Russia for 20 decades, and I've been following it very closely, that little period of liberalization that happened gradually was changing. And then after 2011, I think the screws were tightening and it was getting worse and worse. But there was some kind of strategic movement in that direction from the Kremlin. In Ukraine, they never had that. They always had these rulers who would maybe steal and maybe they would be more corrupt, but they never had the strategic power and will to put the country under control and create some kind of authoritarian state. We're talking about 40 million people, it's not easy to control 40 million people. In Russia, they control 150 million because the machine is very strong. And in Ukraine, it was just growing and developing and people were traveling to the West and they saw how the West West lives, and democratic freedoms are very appealing to people. It was wild West that gradually turned into this democratic free market oriented society. And Ukrainian presidents, maybe they were, we've changed 6 presidents so far. In neighboring countries like Belarus and Russia, the rulers are sitting there for 20 years. There is a striking difference between that. But Ukraine has never been officially part of the EU or any European Union or any European society. So they are fresh, they're fighting for what they want to have. And most people, they don't even really know the ideological side of what they're fighting for. They just want to live in a happy place where they can work, they can follow the rule of law, they can do things, they can, they don't expect much from the government. They don't want to live in the police state. And in that case, they are like the West, but they're not part of the West. So they have to work a lot harder to preserve that freedom. And when Putin tries to take it away from them, it's too late. People, 40 million people, about 40 million people, they have already tasted the freedom. They don't want to go back to how Russia lives and whispering, being afraid to talk on the phone, where journalists get killed, where people cannot speak up, where most people who want to say something, they have to leave the country. Ukraine became this oasis for people coming from Russia and from Belarus and from, whatever country is welcoming them. Whatever country did not seem good for people, Russian-speaking people live. They came to Kyiv and they started living in Kyiv, where, yes, it's Ukraine, but it's also comfortable enough for them to continue doing what they're doing. It's scary for somebody like Putin. He wants to take it away, but it's impossible to take it away because the country is already developing in their own capacity. It's like it's out of control. It's just going in its own direction.
Well, I think that's an under-remarked reason for why Putin felt compelled to make this invasion, because having a functioning democracy right next to him like that is a bad example. And people would want to go there, right, instead of be in Russia. And that's a problem for him. We're going to need to wrap up, but I wanted you to tell us the best ways that our listeners, if they want to support Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees, where they can go, where are trusted places, where are safe and good places for them to go and help.
There is this organization in New York called Razom for Ukraine. This organization is very trustworthy and they can always direct people to other organizations and charities where they can contribute. I think in any way to assist Ukrainian refugees or people in Ukraine by donating money to something that seems credible, any medical organizations or organizations that help children, that's great too. From where I stand, I think it's very important to just not fall into the trap of Russian propaganda. And I think it's one of the ways how your audience can contribute. I don't know if your audience would ever fall into that trap, but it's important to remember that Ukraine is one nation, that regardless, whatever the root of the civilization was, they developed into a separate nation that wants to have their own course. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. Russian military is not freeing anyone. They're just bombing cities. And just remembering that message, the NATO was not suffocating Russia through Ukraine. All the messages that Putin is saying, they're false. And I think just, being aware of that, it's also a great way to support Ukraine in this fight.
Katya, we want to thank you for joining us, and listeners, you can read more of what Katya says on Twitter. And also please make sure to check out Forbes coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for ongoing updates. Katya, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.